Hi, everybody. This is the Anti-Disestablishmentarian Podcast. I can't even say it myself. It's been a little bit of time since our last episode, but today, let's start with the big news. First and foremost, as you may have heard, the Ukrainians launched an incredible special operation. We can even call it a special military operation according to reports. Again, this is all very new, but it seems like they may have eliminated about a third of all Russian heavy bombers, the ones they use to attack Ukrainian cities, oftentimes hitting civilian targets. So first, let's take a look at the footage. Let's get a sense of what this operation was about because this operation was incredible in so many ways. Let's start with first what happened. According to reports, you had a bunch of cargo containers that somehow, and there's obviously not a lot of information about how they got into Russia or if they were always in Russia and rigged inside Russia, but they had drones apparently inside the roofs of these containers. So let's take a look at what that might look like. So if we take a look, they released some pictures. I believe this came from the Ukrainian side of how these drones were hidden. Again, you can see the containers there in the back. And apparently, a big part of these containers was made out of wood. That was to hide the drones. And so they were on the very top. And you can see some other pictures about how they were packed in. So you can see there's quite a few per container. And there they are, the containers that ultimately made their way to Russia and were parked near the bases. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at specifically what they looked like in action. Um, Here it is. You'll see in just a moment the drone actually lifting out of the container, right? So there it is. You'll see it. That's the container. And there goes the drone. It's being activated by remote control and flying away to hit its target. Um, Next, let's quickly take a look at specifically which targets they were hitting. And you can see they hit pretty far. One was in Murmansk. That was quite quite a bit of distance from Ukraine. I believe that there was an airfield there that they hit. And again, the Russians purposefully are um, having some of their heavy bombers a little farther from the front lines, knowing the Ukrainians are getting increasingly more adept at hitting these targets. But there's one even farther. You can see right here, all the way close to Siberia over there. And that really is remarkable that they were able to, from all the way over here, be able to hit a target that is, like I said, near the Lake Baikal, one of the deepest lakes, the deepest lake in the world, there by Mongolia. So, I mean, we're talking about Eastern Russia here. And so, yeah, obviously there was also a couple of airfields, the main ones we've heard so much about, near Moscow. And if we take a look, we'll see also a couple of other things here. Specifically, here it is. This is after a lot of the drones have already hit these heavy bombers. They have really stopped producing many of these since the 1990s. There's been about 120 of them. The T-92, I believe, was one of them. The Tupolev 22, I'm sorry. Then there was a couple of others. They're all Tupolevs. And again, a lot of them have stopped being made since the 1990s. They really can't make them anymore. So about 120 in total they're the only available heavy bombers that can actually basically um, that can actually use some of these missiles, the interballistic missiles that the Russians have been firing on Ukraine. Usually they fly to like the Caspian Sea, far away from danger, fire off these cruise missiles or intercontinental ballistic missiles, hitting Ukraine. Again, a lot of these missiles can only be fired from these heavy bombers. So now with about 40 of them, apparently, even 41 of them perhaps, out of service, destroyed. That's about 30-ish% or so of the bombers, according to Ukrainian reports, and the videos seem to back up that quite a few of them were put out of service. So that's a pretty significant amount. And so a lot of these missiles can't be fired from any land-based systems. And so as a result, the Russians now have a bit of an issue. It's not so much the number of missiles they have, because they are able to crank those out on a consistent basis, but more so, where do they fire it from? They can only be from heavy bombers, and now they have about a third less. Keep in mind, about another third of them are usually under maintenance or repairs. So really, they only have now about a third left in active service. We'll see in the coming months if the number of strikes from these missiles start to decrease. The missiles to look out for are, I believe, the KH-22. There's also the KH-55 or 555. So those types of missiles. So with that being said, let's take a look next at a few other things. How are the Russians expected to respond to this? The Russians love to retaliate, especially after Ukraine humiliates them. So a lot of people have been talking about the Orechnik missile. The Orechnik missile, quite frankly, is a very dangerous missile. It's a missile that it's an intimidating missile. It essentially is many missiles in one missile. And what it does is it flies up into the air and then essentially falls apart and then starts to strike the ground. Here, let me go ahead and give you an example of that. So here you see the Oreshnik um, IRBM intermediate range ballistic missile, and you can see that it fires off, then it starts to come apart, and this is what comes out of it. And then once that is leveled or above its target, it starts to go ahead and fire off these missiles. Again, it is considered an intimidating missile. I believe it has the potential to even carry nuclear warheads, which is why it's intimidating. Some people have been saying there have been some rumors that the Russians are getting to launch these. As of today, as of right now, they have not launched them. We'll see what happens in the coming days. I would be very surprised if the Russians don't do anything. Keep in mind the peace talks, quote unquote, peace talks are expected to resume tomorrow, June 2nd. It's already June 2nd in Ukraine at the time of this video. Like I mentioned, I think the Ukrainian delegation will be walking with their heads held up high and a bit of a wind at their back because of the success of this operation. I would put this operation to be akin to that of the sinking of the Moskva in the first year of combat. Remember, the Ukrainians were able to essentially sink the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Navy. That came as a big surprise. But also the Crimean Bridge. Remember, there was a truck that drove over it. It blew up right by the oil tankers, by the oil train cargo, and essentially made the bridge unusable, at least as far as the train goes, um, unusable for months. And so this, I think, is right up there with these two operations. Very impressive. And again, I would say that it seemed like Ukraine really needed the morale booster, and they got one with this operation. We'll see what the Russians do. I don't think it's going to be that much of a game changer in terms of changing the negotiations. I don't think the Russians are going to do anything necessarily different. I do think they feel humiliated. I think Putin was furious today, livid at what happened. And I do think, from a military standpoint, it gives Ukraine a little bit more breathing room, especially when it comes to these almost now nightly attacks that the Russians have been launching, particularly during these negotiations. So hopefully, that in the coming months, like we said, was going to be on a lower level. But a couple of other interesting tidbits. It was reported today by, I believe, CBS that Trump and the Americans never got word of this. The Ukrainians never told them, and I have to say, it's for a good reason. Trump simply cannot be trusted with this type of information. There's a good chance he would have tipped off the Russians. He probably thinks this is going against his quote unquote peace talks. For far too long, he's been blaming the Ukrainians for not agreeing to a ceasefire. And I think he would have probably told the Ukrainians not to do it. The Ukrainians rightfully did what they should have done, which is go ahead and activate this military operation. And the beauty of this operation is that it only it only targeted military military targets. It only targeted military targets. The drones specifically went for the heavy bombers, the ones that have been terrorizing Ukrainian cities. You really can't argue with the legality of this. And so, again, the Trump administration had no business in leaking it to the Russians or knowing about it. And again, it shows that the Ukrainians can't stand on their own 2 feet. So, fully agree with that decision. Now, the big question, of course, is what does what does Putin want? Because we've been getting a lot of mixed signals. And for a long time, I believed that he would have agreed to a ceasefire, but I'm less confident now. And it comes down to what are his goals. And so today, what I want to do is talk about three major goals that Putin might be looking at. The first goal is to basically take over Ukraine at any cost. And so, like he said during a negotiation a few months ago, maybe less than a month ago, just a few weeks ago, I think actually, that basically they fought the Swedes in the Great Northern War and they fought them for 21 years and they'll fight for as long as they need to. And the reason why it's important to understand Putin's true goals is because we'll see in the coming weeks which concessions he prizes, which demands he prizes or prioritizes. And so if his goal, and then we can obviously, Ukraine, the West can respond accordingly. But if his goal is ultimately to usurp Ukraine, then what you're going to see him do is essentially insist on a few very specific things. If he wants Ukraine now, so I'm going to call option one Ukraine now, not later, but now, he will essentially make unrealistic demands of Ukraine or the West and keep the war going for as long as possible. Now, you might say it's been a standstill. Why would he want to do that? It won't take 20, at this rate, it will take centuries for them to take over Ukraine. That is how slow the advance has been moving. And so then, what is he hoping for? Can he really afford to lose? They're close to 1 million casualties now. Can he really afford to lose a few more million just to take over Ukraine? And so I believe that there is a possibility that he may be betting on Trump walking away from the negotiations and also walking away from supporting Ukraine. If that is Putin's goal, then two things must happen. Number one, Trump must walk away both from negotiations after growing frustrated with them and basically wash his hands clean of supporting Ukraine. Number two, then the Russians, after American aid essentially stops, Putin must believe that that's going to somehow give him a significant battlefield advantage where he can change the momentum of the war. I find both of those assumptions to be questionable. Number one, walking away based on how things are going and not supporting Ukraine, it's not impossible. I can see Trump doing it. But he's the one who's been saying bad things are going to happen if Putin doesn't come to the table to negotiate. There might be secondary sanctions. There's a bill in the Senate, a bill in the House. So I don't know if Trump is just going to walk away if Russia refuses to agree to a ceasefire. I think more likely is he'll probably start to look the other way as Congress, the Senate, and the House start to pass either a sanctions bill or maybe a little less likely another aids package. And maybe he won't veto it and just kind of see where that goes. But also, an even more questionable assumption is whether that'll actually give Russia enough of an advantage to overrun the Ukrainian defenses. And I think that's even more unlikely because The Europeans are stepping up, and the Ukrainians have also stepped up, and they have millions of drones at this point. They're producing a lot of shells themselves. The industrial capacity of Europe is increasing. There's the Czech initiative, where they basically are able to get millions of shells for Ukraine by buying them off the market. And so I think in many ways the Ukrainians might be able to hold on without the Americans. But again, that might be Putin's first option, Ukraine now. Then there is option number two. This is the one that I think he's probably going for, Ukraine later. What does Ukraine later mean? It means that he doesn't want to give up Ukraine. He believes Ukraine is historically Russian, at least the central and eastern parts. The majority of Ukraine, Kiev, Odessa, Kharkiv, these are huge cities, the biggest cities in Ukraine, and he believes they are Russian. So what would you do if you were Putin in that case? Well, there are some things that are completely unpalatable to Putin that could really create problems if they happen, and that would not allow him to essentially take over Ukraine either now or in the future. The big one is, of course, the reassurance force. If you have Western military forces in Ukraine, in Kiev, in Odessa, they've been talking about only having them in West Ukraine, west of the Dnieper, but I would like for them to be also east of the Dnieper in Kharkiv, in Chernigiv, in Sumy, in Zaporozhye, and a few other places like Kramatorsk. I think that if the reassurance forces are there, he's much less likely to attack. But that's why the Europeans are dragging their feet, because they know that while he's less likely to attack, if he attacks, that's going to lead to a war, and they're going to be now direct participants in it. But hopefully, so that's number one. Putin is going to insist on there not being any NATO soldiers. Doesn't matter if they're officially part of NATO or not, any soldiers from NATO countries. He'll probably frame it as any foreign soldiers, but I think he'll emphasize the NATO aspect because it feeds into his narrative. But other problems can arise as well. He knows that if there's a ceasefire called, Ukraine is going to continue to arm itself, and the next time it might be even harder for them to come in. So he's going to insist on also Western weaponry to be stopped from going to Ukraine, and from any training exercise to be stopped from happening in Ukraine. And if you see Putin really insisting on this above all else, then that's going to be a Ukraine later scenario. In other words, he's going to want Ukraine later. But the third option is, I would say, maybe Ukraine later. And in that case, he might kind of say, okay, I'll settle for a ceasefire now because the cost I'm paying in terms of lives and economically is unsustainable. But I want to give myself the option to go in later if I choose to. Well, in that case, he'll probably have to not be so insistent upon the weapons and reducing Ukrainian military, but he'll probably insist on the one thing that will really stop him from going in a second time is the reassurance force. So in that case, you'll see him saying, we don't want a reassurance force. Again, that's a red flag. That's a dead giveaway. He wants the option to go in later. And he'll figure out later if he wants to go in or not. The reason why it's such a dangerous option, you might say to yourself, well, he got his teeth kicked in with this invasion. A million casualties, not a single regional center taken since the start of the full invasion. He got a land bridge to Crimea, but that's about it. It's been basically a standstill for the last, what, year and a half, 2 years, maybe 2.5 years. And so why would he go back in again? Well, he might not go in now. He might not go in next year or the year after. But if the economy starts to really suffer and his approval ratings start to really plummet, he might all of a sudden find it within his appetite to invade Ukraine again. Keep in mind, other things might also happen that might make another invasion of Ukraine even more appetizing. Belarus is, in my opinion, for all intent and purposes, now part of Russia. And he's just waiting for Lukashenko to leave. As soon as he does, I think Russia comes in and essentially takes over. If that happens, now Ukraine is surrounded even more so than before. Right now, Belarus has allowed the Russians to attack, but then they withdrew, and I think now they're essentially trying to say, we don't want your forces attacking from Belarus. But that might change. And all of a sudden, that might become problematic for Ukraine because all of a sudden they'll be attacked again, like it was in the beginning of the invasion from all sides. And I do believe Putin regrets leaving some of the northern territories that he had in the beginning of the war. And I don't know if he would make that decision again, even if he couldn't take Kiev. So there's Ukraine now, which is where, again, he kind of basically pretends he wants to negotiate but doesn't and makes unrealistic demands. There's Ukraine later, where he basically tries to do everything he can to make sure that he can invade again later. There's Ukraine maybe later, where he kind of insists that there's no reassurance force. You see him kind of really trying to insist on that. Like we said, that's a giveaway. He wants the option. And then there's basically a real ceasefire, a real peace agreement. That's not, it's becoming less likely based on how Putin has been acting because he's really been dragging out the negotiations and insisting on unrealistic claims. But there's a chance, a realistic chance, that he's just being an extremely tough negotiator. And he's probably thinking, I'll get whatever I can. Whatever I can get, I'll get. He would have agreed to a ceasefire for much less, but he knows that Trump ran on getting a ceasefire in 24 hours, and he'll get whatever he can. And if it takes a year to get as many concessions out of Trump and the West, then he'll do that. And there's a possibility of that because if he wanted to really do this, then he would be doing exactly what he's doing now, dragging out the negotiations. Only once it seems like he's hit a complete dead end and they're about to fall apart, giving in just a little bit, and then slowly getting as many concessions out as possible. Again, it's becoming less likely because the Trump administration really has given him anything they can. They've given him things that I don't even think Putin thought he could get. First, they basically have implicitly said they'll remove the sanctions. Second, they basically said no more Ukraine in NATO. Third, they basically said we will officially recognize Crimea as part of Russia, which to me is just crazy, but okay. I mean, that's already a lot more than I think a lot of people thought he was hoping for, Putin. And so why isn't he agreeing to it? Well, maybe he thinks he can get more. Specifically, what can he get more? I think he's realizing that Ukraine will never officially cede territory. So I doubt, unless the defensive lines completely collapse. So I doubt he's hoping for that. He probably knows that in the Ukrainian constitution, it will take for them too long to go back to neutrality right now. They used to have neutrality in their constitution. Now they're talking about how their goal is to become part of NATO. I believe it takes over a year for them to change the constitution, at least two readings during two separate parliaments or something like that. So him insisting on that doesn't seem very realistic, even though he has been bringing that up. And what else is there? He's also basically saying he wants the full four territories. Again, that's crazy. It seems very unlikely that he'll be able to jump back to Kherson City across the river that he left in 2022. So that doesn't seem realistic, let alone Zaporozhye City, which is a very big city. He hasn't been able to take a city of that size. And so, again, it seems unlikely. It seems very unlikely that he'll be able to get any of those things from Ukraine. So then what else does he want, realistically speaking? Well, maybe he wants the West to agree to drop sanctions. The West will, I believe, say it's up to Ukraine. If Ukraine wants us to drop sanctions, we will. Ukraine might say, to heck with it, drop the sanctions. That's not going to stop them from invading again. So give us a reassurance force and drop the sanctions. Um, we'll see how all of this plays out in the next few weeks, but I do think we'll find out soon what his true intentions are and what he wants. In the beginning, I thought it was more like have the option to invade Ukraine later. I'm starting to think it's going to be one of the first two options, either Ukraine now, which is very hard to envision how he would do that, or two, Ukraine later, but with a very specific plan to go in later. And that really might be problematic for negotiations. So the war could drag out for quite a bit of time. And again, a lot of this depends also on what happens with the West. So that's it for today, and we'll see what happens. All right.